Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. Just thought I'd do a video on Thomas Frank, since he's expected to be the new Tottenham boss at the moment. As things stand, it's Tuesday morning as I'm filming this up in Nottingham ahead of the England game against Senegal. But as it stands, Spurs on Monday finally opened official talks with Brentford, which is often the last thing to happen really in these deals, as they try to strike a deal to take Thomas Frank from Brentford. He's understood to have a release clause which is about 10 million or maybe just over. So it's a matter of Tottenham, like I say, striking a deal for Thomas Frank. Obviously they sacked Ange Postecoglou 16 days after he won their first trophy in 17 years with the Europa League, and Thomas Frank is their number one target. And at this stage, I'm pretty much expecting the deal to go through. Yesterday I was told it'd be about 48 hours. And it's just a matter of when, it seems, at this point. So with that in mind, it feels like a good time to have a look at Thomas Frank and what he's brought at Brentford over his now nearly 7 years at the club, which at the moment, whilst he remains Brentford manager, makes him the third longest serving manager in the top four leagues in England. Just Pep Guardiola at Man City ahead of him, and I think it's Simon Weaver at Harrogate Town, who's been there for 16 years, a long time, but really underlines what an impact Thomas Frank has made at Brentford, to the point where he was at the club when I was still covering the Football League, where I used to have a role covering the EFL as it was then, between about 2014 and 2018, where the likes of Eddie Howe's Bournemouth won promotion that first season. I covered them, and I've covered a lot of Brentford, even though it was a nationwide role, being based in London and Brentford being a really interesting team. I did a lot of interviews down there. Didn't actually ever interview Thomas Frank because he was mainly the assistant when I was in the latter days of covering that job. It was Dean Smith who was the number one, but I remember interviewing Dean Smith. But Thomas Frank always made a really big impact. He obviously got given the role after being an assistant, despite being the manager at Brøndby previously. He had an interesting start where he lost a lot of games, which anyone who sort of looked into his backstory will have realised, but it sort of speaks to the faith that Brentford had in him and the underlying numbers in those early games when he wasn't winning matches. They stuck with him, and it proved to be an absolutely brilliant decision from Matthew Benham, the Brentford owner, because Brentford just grew and grew, finally got promoted, and then they've established themselves as a sort of Premier League stalwart, really, or a mainstay in the last 4 seasons, earning 2 top 10 finishes, including this season, and beating a lot of big teams along the way. Most teams that I can think of, really, including, do you remember that win at Man City, where Ivan Toney scored twice, which when City were really purring, but also obviously battering Man United, Erik ten Hag's Man United 4-0, and they beat Spurs a few times along the way as well. So plenty of great results. Done in lots of different ways with lots of different players, which whilst I've said before about Ange Postecoglou, I'm disappointed that Spurs have, from a personal point of view, that the Spurs decided to move him on, given that he'd won their first trophy in a long time. But if it is to be Thomas Frank who takes over, I think he's a really good appointment who really deserves his chance, having earned his stripes at Brentford and shown what he's all about in so many different facets. So I thought I'd have a little look at how, looking at the current Brentford 11, and I must admit, a huge shout out to Ryan Hurst, who is a YouTuber that I checked this video out and quite influenced on his breakdown of the Brentford most recent sort of team and how they've sort of played influenced this video on how I think that might mask itself onto Tottenham. Tottenham's current team before they make any signings, because presumably they will make signings. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk of Bryan Mbeumo, who really does feel like he would be a great signing for Spurs anyway, because he's a top player. 20 Premier League goals and 7 assists shows you that, but also with the way that Frank presumably wants to play. And there's a lot of assumptions here that he will play the same way as he did at Brentford, and that, let's be honest, I would not be surprised if that wasn't the case, given how tactically flexible he has shown himself to be at Brentford, and the fact that he's arguably going to have better players now. There's a big debate about that, given this Spurs squad finished 17th in the league, and that he might adjust slightly now he's at Spurs. But you can only really judge a horse on the races it's run, and look at the form that and the way he's played previously to really get a flavour of how he might set up. So I'll come on to that in a minute, but let's just talk a little bit about Thomas Frank. So Obviously, it's quite well known now that he and Johan Lange, the Tottenham technical director, worked together at a small club called Lyngsby nearly 2 decades ago. It's on the outskirts of Copenhagen. They actually shared an office together when they were coaching together, and so they're very close, or they have been very close in the past. So that's been obviously picked up upon. Obviously, Lange used to be at Aston Villa. It's probably no surprise that there was a lot of talk about Thomas Frank going to Aston Villa before Emery came in. So that connection means there's already a solid connection between those two. Albeit I would say with Tottenham, just because there's a sort of Danish connection here and a close relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that either of them will be safe for the long term, because that was proven by Ange Postecoglou and Scott Munn. The Australian connection neither lasted more than 2 years at Spurs. I'm not sure if Munn's departure has been confirmed yet. I don't think it has, but I'm fully expecting it to be. But anyway, it's good that there's a sort of dovetailing between, or there should be theoretically a dovetailing between the technical director, the man who's behind trying to identify the new signings and sign players, with the manager himself in Thomas Frank. There's so much stuff out there about Thomas Frank that you can sort of go through, but just some of the key lines, I think, of sort of define him to a certain extent. His influence by the New Zealand team of the no dickheads policy. The idea being there's no one in the team that thinks they're better than the team. They don't carry any massive egos in that Brentford side throughout their time there, and that made the team better. No one put themselves before the team, and you'd like to think that'd be the same at Spurs. He's got a really good track record, I think, of improving players, making them better than what they were before. I mean, just look at the track record of strikers, really. You could look at lots of different positions. David Raya, for example, the way he came on before he went to Arsenal. But there's lots of different positions where he has a good track record of improving players. But I just look at the forwards. Ivan Toney, taken from Peterborough, wasn't it? Where he was scoring goals for fun in League One, I believe, if they were still League One. They did have a stint in the Championship. I think it was League One. And then he helped turn him into a predatory Championship striker. Then a great goal scorer in the Premier League, obviously played for England off the back of that, and then moved to Saudi Arabia, which I personally is a bit of a shame. I think I'd love to see him still in the Premier League, but no doubt he's a really top player. Ollie Watkins, obviously, a fellow player who's gone on to play for England, who I remember interviewing Ollie when he was back at Exeter before he'd moved to Brentford, but definitely the way he developed Watkins was a big part of Brentford's development and Watkins' own development in turning into like a top Premier League striker. And then obviously Brian Mbeumo this season, who I remember when he was playing in the Championship, even though he was very young, not being wholly convinced that he would be able to follow in the similar path to Watkins and Toney, and to a lesser extent Neil Maupay, who also left for 20 million to Brighton. Never really quite worked out for him, despite him scoring goals for fun in the Championship. But look, Brian Mbeumo has completely blown that theory away, and he's arguably, if not the best of the lot, then he's right up there after 20 Premier League goals. So great track record of improving players, which is a real exciting quality about Thomas Frank, given the amount of young talent in the Tottenham squad, from Lucas Bergwijn to Archie Gray, Brennan Johnson. I mean, just on those two players, Johnson and Gray, it is also interesting to know that Brentford were heavily in for both of those players. Archie I think Brentford might have been having a bid accepted by Leeds last summer before he went to Spurs. Brennan Johnson, Brentford became very close to signing Johnson just before the end of the PSR window from Nottingham Forest. Then they rejected it, he stayed, and then he moved to Spurs late on. And then this is where Forest sort of argued their case, if you remember, about breaching PSR rules, that it was worth more to them to sell him for Spurs for another sort of 15 million than sell him to Brentford at the time. But anyway, the point being is they liked both players. They were in for both players. Presumably Frank gave the okay on both players. So you'd like to think he could do quite big things with both of them. I would say Johnson was one of those players that Postecoglou definitely did improve when you look at his goal return. So hopefully Frank can build on that. And it'll be interesting to see where he plays him. I'll come on to that in a bit. Archie Gray is someone that Postecoglou gave a lot of experience to, but almost through having his hand forced. Obviously played him at centre-back a lot when he had that centre-back crisis. He didn't really give him that many opportunities, and what we believe is his preferred, well, definitely his preferred role of central midfield. It's just whether that turns out to be his position going forward, I don't know. But the fact that Frank wanted to sign him makes you think that he should hopefully be in for I don't know, more game time, more development when it comes to Thomas Frank's arrival, providing it happens. Set pieces, obviously massive for Brentford. It's something that I don't really feel that Spurs ever really, did that well on with Postecoglou. They did score some goals from it. Bentancur against Ipswich, that header. The goal, I think, away from Boda. I believe that came from a Romero knockdown, if I can remember rightly. There were obviously goals they scored from set pieces. There were obviously goals they conceded from set pieces, particularly in that first season where it became a bit of a thing, albeit Postecoglou didn't really help himself by almost dismissing the importance of them publicly, or at least opening the door that people started to think he didn't care about them, which obviously he did. But anyway, the point being is that Frank definitely does have a big focus on set pieces. I would not be surprised to see him hire a set piece coach, unlike Ange, who sort of split it with some of his coaching staff, rather than having a designated set piece taker, which is what you see a lot from modern coaches and modern clubs. Wouldn't be surprised to see them adopt a long throw policy. I'm not sure exactly who in the Tottenham squad has that in their locker. I can't really think of many times where they've tried that. Maybe Jed Spence, I'm not sure, but it'd be interesting to see who that is. And then obviously Brentford had this little run last season where they kept scoring within the first minute of games, and Frank himself said it was it was very much a planned routine, and it was a orchestrated thing. It just kept happening, which even he couldn't believe it kept happening, but it was planned. And you might remember the goal that Brian Mbeumo scored, a brilliant left-footed volley, I think it was, in the first minute of the Brentford's game away to Spurs. I forget which month it was during that run where they kept scoring, albeit Spurs did manage to turn that one around. I think they won 3-1 in the end for that game. Tactical flexibility, I mean, this is something which I know frustrated a lot of the people around Ange. He never really deviated from his preferred back four. It's only really late on that he deviated from the sort of 4-1-2-3 formation. It was only towards the end, ironically, how he won the Europa League was very much with two pivots in midfield rather than just one holding midfielder. And it's something that he, let's be honest, looking back, I feel like he could have employed more often and quicker, even though when he first came to the club, Yves Bissouma was brilliant in that sort of holding midfield role on his own. But I feel like as teams started to work Spurs out a bit, that became a lot on that holding midfielder. You have to be like Rodri type to be able to handle that amount of responsibility where, you're like the only man in that midfield sort of defensively, particularly when there was Maddison and Kulusevski ahead of him. And then also be able to start attacks and beat the press. It was a lot. It was not a surprise to see Bissouma perform better once his role was kind of changed towards the end of that Europa League run, where he was in there with Bentancur, both holding in what you call a double pivot these days. And that is something that I imagine Frank might well employ quite a lot. But he's proved himself to be quite adaptable with his tactics. Of late it's been mainly a sort of 4-3-3, I suppose, or 4-2-1, kind of similar to Ange's most recent tactics with a sort of number 10 and strikers out wide. But even when they don't have the ball, it sort of reverts more to a more rigid 4-4-2. But he's definitely played 3-5-2 a lot of the time as well during his time at Brentford. So I think you can see him sort of maybe mixing it up a little bit more than you definitely saw with Ange if he is appointed. More sort of specifically, obviously the pressing game when Ange was at the top of his game was a huge part of what Spurs wanted to be. In that early part of the season that's just gone, they were beating all teams across Europe for their pressing numbers, and when they were at their best, they used to sort of swarm teams with their press. But it also, as the injuries sort of kicked in, they sort of struggled a bit more on being able to maintain that. I think when it comes to Frank's style of pressing, yes, it'll be similarly man-to-man, but it might be a bit more selective. It might not always be sort of lung-busting runs every time, no matter what. It might be sort of judging each situation on its merits, I suppose. Similarly with the high line, which became sort of synonymous with Postecoglou at times, even though it kind of did, it definitely changed towards the end of the Europa League run, which again made that Europa League victory so ironic that it was completely the opposite of the principles of Ange ball, and the team played a lot deeper and a lot less risky, far more with less risk. I think with Frank, he is happy to adopt a sort of low block, as they call it now, a deeper line at times, not always, but again that sort of speaks to his adaptability, and that could be a big part of it. If you look at the statistics with Brentford, and maybe he would argue that this was sort of almost a horses for courses situation with the quality of the Premier League and the opponents they came up to, they haven't been the most hugely possession-based team. I think there's a bit of a debate generally in football at the moment about the sort of merits of being a possession-based team anyway these days. I mean, obviously when Guardiola came in and he showed what it can do and how important it can be, there was a lot of carbon copies across the league. I think of like Graham Potter at Brighton, and it did have its merits, but also I think that people have come to the realisation that possession without a sort of real point to it, just keeping the ball but not actually hurting the opponent, doesn't really have a lot of point to it. What's the point in having the ball if you're not going to do anything with it? And so after, not to say that was an issue with Ange, but I think the Spurs fan base would be more open to a more pragmatic style, not going all the way back to Conte when it was bad, I suppose, style of play. They want to be entertained in the Tottenham way and all that kind of thing. But I think they would be open to a bit more sort of, as I say, horses for courses situation. Keep the ball when they can, but if they're under the cosh or playing against a team of better quality, I think they'll be more than happy to see possession, because that's actually how they got past Burda, for example, in the Europa League semi-final first leg, I thought. But anyway, with Frank, he's generally being less possession-based. Maybe that will change with Spurs again, with better quality technicians on the ball, if you believe that they do have that, because Brentford have got good midfield players as well. They can be more direct, yes, but with a sort of point to it, and they can be quite flexible. Again, I recommend this video from Ryan Hurst where he talks a lot about these specifics and drills into the statistic numbers. I think those do sort of really underline these points. But just briefly from it, they win the most. I think they've won the most aerial duels at the back, or in the whole Premier League, which shows how competitive they can be across the team, particularly at the back defensively, and that might speak to the kind of centre backs he picks, particularly if Romero were to leave. Not actually many yellow cards, which is interesting. Yes, they look to move the ball up the pitch very quickly, and that can be through direct sort of long balls, but I don't think that will be to the detriment of the style of the aesthetic of the style of play. That could be quite thrilling. Again, keeping the ball's sake can be quite dull. And when you think back to Conte, I mean, it was definitely not all bad. That season when they won a top four place to get into the Champions League, when they were breaking on the counter-attack at absolute rapid pace, that was thrilling. That was thrilling to watch. And I think you could definitely see that in Thomas Frank's Tottenham. There'll be a lot of hitting, running, breaking at speed, maybe with sort of long balls from the back, but accurate long balls. And that's about it. So just looking at before we consider signings that they might make, and they definitely will make some, and players will leave as well. So Brentford's most common 11 of late has been effectively a 4-2-1-3. So Flecken in goal, who's obviously left since, but we're not talking about Brentford here. But anyway, Flecken in goal, Coyote at right back, Collins and Van der Berg at centre back, who seem to be quite sort of physical, classic kind of centre backs, I suppose, rather than sort of completely ball playing centre backs, which is interesting. Lewis Potter at left back. Now he's a winger really, and a right-footed winger. So we'll come on to how that might mirror Spurs, if at all, because it might be just the fact that he didn't have a player of Destiny Udogi's quality. You would expect that. Norgard and Yarmouk in that sort of double pivot in midfield. Damsgaard, who is a fantastic player at sort of number 10, who's their sort of creative hub. Then a rapid front three of Mbeumo on the right, Johan Visser centre forward, who's had this unbelievable season goals-wise, and Kevin Schade, who's probably overlooked because he doesn't score as many goals, but is absolutely lightning fast and is a big part of it. So how might that reflect to Spurs. So first of all, just looking at those qualities of that team, pace is obviously massive on the counter. Those front three are so quick. And it does feel like if Frank was to try and adopt a similar policy, he might look for another forward. It would not be a surprise for him to go after Mbeumo, and think he'd be a really good signing just because of how quick that is. And you look at the front three of Spurs at the moment, particularly Sonny, not as quick as he once was. Kulusevski's not really, really quick. He's speedy, but not to those levels. And you do think that they would look for someone, particularly out wide, with a bit more pace. But also that team, when it's not got the ball, does seem to adapt more into a sort of 4-4-2 defensive shape, quite rigid. So I wonder if some of these players have got this. Well, I mean, I guess this is where it comes to coaching. The current Spurs squad, where they can be trained into being very defensively sound when they haven't got the ball. As I mentioned, Lewis Potter at left back is really interesting. So obviously you presume Vicario in goal, albeit Kinski I'm sure will look to stake his claim when Frank comes in. Porro probably at right back. Left back's interesting, so I presume it will be a doggy, and this is where the squad could be very much the team could easily go into a sort of 3-5-2, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But if they were looking to sort of mirror exactly how they play at the moment, if Frank feels that Lewis Potter at left back with his creative abilities is such a key part to how they build up, then Jed Spence has been fantastic at an inverted left back position. So I wonder if that might be a bit of a shout for him, because in the Brentford team, Yarmolenko often drops into, when Lewis Potter goes forward, Yarmolenko can almost drop into a sort of back three with Colin, or back four, I guess, filling in at left back, which is where I think Archie Gray could be interesting, because Gray's obviously played there. If he can develop in that holding midfielder, I wonder if he might come into that role, or Basuma potentially, or someone new, of course. Norgaard's a really solid midfielder with real good tactical awareness. I'm not really sure who would sort of be the equivalent of him. I suppose Bentancur, who's such a top technical player, but I don't know. It's hard to know. The midfield is a really interesting one, and then you've got Damsgaard, who has so many different qualities. He's obviously a really creative player. He's one of the most underrated players in the Premier League. He's one that if people don't watch football that much, people don't even know who he is. And if you watch Brentford a lot, he's a creator. He's really good on the ball, but he also manages to keep hold of the ball really, really well. And he can also drop deep and pick it up quite well as well. Now, of the obvious player for that is James Maddison. But I also wonder about Lucas Bergvall. I really wonder about Lucas Bergvall, because when you think of those qualities, and he's so young and only getting better, his ability to drop deep, his ability to keep hold of the ball, he showed quite a lot last season. So I wonder if that sort of number 10 position could be Maddison Bergvall kind of situation next season. Then up front, Solanke's more of a stay in the middle kind of centre forward, whereas for Brentford you often saw Mbeumo and Vissa sort of switching, or Charlotte and Vissa switching. So there's a lot of rotations at the top of the Brentford attack. But 65 million on Solanke, I think he's definitely going to play, and he's probably going to be more of a centre forward. But we'll see. He does have the ability to adapt his game. And then I wonder if Johnson might move to the left. I'm almost dismissing Sonny, and that might be really, really disrespectful. And maybe Thomas Frank really much does have him in mind. But I think with the speed that Frank likes to play with, I'm not sure exactly where he fits in as much. And I really would not be surprised if Spurs can have a bid acceptable, because he's obviously such a, he's a legend, but he's also a commercial dream with the amount of interest and money that people spend from South Korea. I did a video on that a little while ago, so you go back and check that out to see if he leaves. But he's obviously still got 12 months left on his contract. I would not be surprised. So I'm wondering if Johnson, who when he first signed I thought was more going to play on the left-hand side, cutting onto his right, I wonder if he goes there and then Kulusevski on the right as it stands. But if they signed someone like Mbeumo, wouldn't be surprised really. And then I don't know. I didn't talk about the centre backs either. I mean, presumably it's Romero and Van de Ven who would fit into that really, really well. If Romero were to leave, if he's unhappy with Postecoglou's departure or some of the hints he made last season, or Spurs get a bid they deem acceptable from Atletico, then I wonder about Radu Dragozin when he's back fit. He's someone that never really seemed to suit Postecoglou's style of play. The only time I feel like he did and it was a real backs to the wall, sort of anti-Ange ball style of play, of which we saw later on, albeit he'd done his cruise ship by then. He seems to be doing well, by the way. I imagine I think he's sort of looking to be back for sort of August time, but I'll check out on that. But in this style of play with Brentford, I think he could be quite well suited. So I wouldn't be surprised to see him sort of come back into the fray to a certain extent. I know he's been sort of dismissed by a lot of Spurs fans, but he's still so young and relatively inexperienced. He's not only is he sort of 23 now, maybe 22, 23, but he also hasn't actually played that many games. But I wonder if Frank might look at him and think, yes, there's something I can definitely work with there. So let's see. Lots to sort of consider. Still got to wait for it to be confirmed. It does really very much feel like at this point that that's where the direction of travel is headed to Thomas Frank at Spurs. And they'll obviously look to bring in certain players as well and ship players out as well. So lots to consider. But whilst, as I said from the top, disappointed Postecoglou is gone, felt like he deserved another go. But if it is to be someone else, I am quite excited as a neutral about Thomas Frank. And I, for once, haven't even mentioned until now how the sort of media side and how he's great for journalists as well. But this is more looking at what he might bring to the team, what fans really care about, and why I think he's a good fit and why he deserves the chance as well. So let's see. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, guys, what you think. Just finally, before I go, thank you to everyone who watches this and follows these videos throughout the season. It's been fun watching it grow and build. But I am fully aware there was a big or relatively big compared to the size of my relatively meagre subscribership compared to like Ali, for example, that there was a lot of Aussie interest. And as some of you have sort of already commented, and understandably so, that's up now. Now Ange is gone. You won't be following anymore, and I totally understand. And thank you for watching. Appreciate that. Ange was your primary focus. If you've got any Spurs supporting friends, I suppose, who aren't so just wedded to Ange, but more about Tottenham, who aren't aware of this channel, please let them know. I will continue doing these videos into what I expect to be the Thomas Frank era. Cheers, guys.